Marcus Delane was 13 years old, standing barefoot on a gravel driveway in Barstow, California, holding a garbage bag stuffed with everything he owned, when his stepfather's truck disappeared down Route 58 and never came back. It was August 14, 2009. The asphalt was so hot it blistered the soles of his feet, and the only sound left in the world was the hum of power lines and the dry wind carrying dust that tasted like chalk. His mother had died 11 months earlier of ovarian cancer. She was 39. His stepfather, Ray Colvin, had tolerated Marcus exactly as long as the life insurance checks kept coming, which turned out to be 10 months and 16 days. On that morning, Ray had set Marcus's garbage bag on the porch, said the words, "I ain't your daddy and this ain't your house," and driven away eating a breakfast burrito like it was any other Tuesday. Marcus stood there for 45 minutes. He counted. He counted because counting was the only thing that kept him from screaming. He had no grandparents he knew of. His mother had grown up in foster care herself. His biological father was a name on a birth certificate he had never seen, a man called Edward Delane, who his mother described exactly once as a good man who got lost. That was all she ever said. Marcus didn't even know if Edward was alive or dead. But here is where the story turns. Because 3 weeks after Marcus was placed in a group home in San Bernardino, a letter arrived. It was addressed to him by full legal name, Marcus Edward Delane, and it came from a law office in a town called Ridgecrest, which sat on the edge of the Mojave Desert about 100 miles northeast of where he was sleeping on a bunk bed that smelled like bleach and someone else's sweat. The letter said that his paternal grandfather, a man named Joseph Delane, had died at the age of 81. Joseph had owned a small property outside Ridgecrest, 47 acres of desert scrubland, assessed at $600 total, which was so worthless that the county had almost seized it twice for unpaid taxes. The letter said Marcus was the sole heir. It said the property contained, and these were the exact words, one subterranean concrete structure partially buried of unknown original purpose, a bunker in the desert, left to him by a grandfather he never knew existed. Marcus read that letter 4 times under the fluorescent lights of the group home common room while a television played cartoons no one was watching. He folded it carefully and put it inside his pillowcase, and for the first time since his mother died, he felt something besides numb. He couldn't name the feeling yet. It was small and sharp, like a splinter working its way toward the surface of his skin. It took Marcus 4 years to get to that property. 4 years in the foster system, bouncing between 3 homes, finishing high school by the skin of his teeth at a continuation school in Hesperia where the classrooms had barred windows. He worked at a gas station. He worked at a tire shop. He saved $1,100 in a coffee can. He kept duct tape to the underside of a dresser drawer because the first family he lived with stole from foster kids. The day he turned 17, he filed the paperwork to emancipate himself. 3 months later, in November of 2013, he bought a '93 Honda Civic for $400 from a mechanic who felt sorry for him, loaded his garbage bag, which was now a duffel bag but held roughly the same amount of belongings, and drove northeast through the Mojave toward Ridgecrest. He had a hand-drawn map from the county assessor's office. The property was 11 miles past the last paved road, down a dirt track that hadn't been maintained since sometime in the 1970s. The Civic bottomed out twice. The radiator temperature gauge climbed into the red. Marcus kept driving because he had nowhere else to go. The desert in November is not what most people imagine. It is not blazing hot. It is cold. The wind comes down from the Sierra Nevada and cuts across the flats like a blade. And the light is so clear and sharp that every rock and Joshua tree looks etched into the landscape with a razor. Marcus could see for 30 miles in every direction and there was nothing. No buildings, no fences, no people. Just pale sand, dark scrub, and a sky so enormous it made his chest ache. He found the property marker first. A rusted iron post driven into the ground with a faded orange tag that read, "The Lane J, parcel 7714, The dirt around it was cracked into polygons like the skin of something ancient and dried out. He got out of the car and stood in the wind, and he could smell creosote bush, that sharp medicinal scent that desert people know means rain came sometime in the last month, and sage, and underneath it all, the mineral smell of earth that hadn't been turned over in decades. The bunker was 200 yards from the road marker, and he almost missed it. It looked like nothing. A low mound of earth, maybe 3 feet above the surrounding desert floor, covered in dried brush, and the remains of a tarp that had been shredded by wind and sun into gray ribbons. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you would have walked right past it. Marcus circled the mound twice before he found the entrance. It was on the north side, a concrete ramp descending at a steep angle into the ground, blocked at the bottom by a steel door that had been painted olive drab at some point in its life and was now the color of rust and dried blood. The ramp was filled with about 2 feet of wind-blown sand and tumbleweeds that had compacted into a dense, scratchy mass. He spent 3 hours clearing that ramp with his bare hands and a tire iron. The sand had turned his palms raw and pink. Tumbleweeds left scratches on his forearms that looked like he'd been in a fight with a cat. By the time he reached the door, the sun was low and the temperature was dropping fast. His shadow stretched 20 feet behind him up the ramp, like something trying to pull him back. The door had no padlock. It had a wheel, like a ship's hatch, crusted with corrosion so thick it looked like the door had grown a skin. Marcus hit it with the tire iron. He hit it again. On the 7th strike, the wheel groaned and moved a 1/4 inch. He wrapped his hands around it, braced his feet against the door frame, and pulled with everything his 140-pound body had. The wheel turned. The door didn't open, it exhaled. A breath of air came out of that bunker that Marcus would never forget as long as he lived. It was cool, impossibly cool compared to even the November desert air, and it smelled like concrete dust, old paper, machine oil, and something else, something faintly sweet that he couldn't identify. It smelled like time, like air that had been sealed away from the world since before he was born. He pushed the door open and stood at the threshold with his phone flashlight cutting a weak beam into absolute darkness. The beam caught dust motes swirling in the disturbed air, thousands of them, like a universe of tiny stars drifting in the black. The first thing he saw was shelves. Metal shelving units, military style, bolted to concrete walls and running the length of the space. The bunker was larger than he expected, roughly 20 feet wide and maybe 50 feet long, with a ceiling just high enough for a tall man to stand without ducking. The shelves were loaded, canned goods, hundreds of them, stacked in neat rows with the labels facing outward, most of them faded beyond reading, but a few still legible. Peaches, pinto beans, condensed milk. Dates on the cans read 1961, 1963, 1965. This bunker had been stocked during the Cuban Missile Crisis and maintained for years afterward. Beyond the shelves, he found tools. Hand tools hung on pegboard with the outlines of each tool painted behind it, so you knew exactly where everything belonged. Wrenches, screwdrivers, a hand drill, saws, files, pliers. Every single one was coated in a thin film of oil. Someone had preserved them carefully. Someone who expected to come back. There were water containers, 5-gallon military jerry cans, olive drab to match the door, stacked 3 high against the back wall. Marcus counted 24 of them. There was a cot with a wool blanket folded at the foot, still intact though stiff with age. There was a kerosene lantern, a metal footlocker, and a small desk made from a plywood board laid across 2 sore horses. And on the desk, there was a notebook. Marcus picked it up. The cover was a model black and white composition book, the kind you buy at any drugstore for 50 cents. It was swollen with moisture that had long since dried, leaving the pages wavy and stiff. On the front, written in pencil and neat block letters, were the words "Property of Joseph P. Dlin, 1960U," his grandfather's handwriting. A man he had never met, never spoken to, never even seen a photograph of. Holding that notebook felt like holding a hand extended across decades. Marcus opened it under the fading light of his phone. The first page contained a list of supplies and quantities, written with military precision. The second page had drawings, technical sketches of the bunker's ventilation system, which Marcus realized he had not yet found. The third page had a date and a single paragraph. November 3rd, 1962. Started the shelter because I believe a man should be prepared to protect what matters. Ellen thinks I'm crazy. Maybe she's right. But I'd rather be crazy and ready than sane and sorry. Ellen. Marcus didn't know who Helen was. His mother had never mentioned her. He read further, but his phone died. The bunker swallowed him in complete darkness. Darkness so total it felt solid, like something pressing against his open eyes. He sat there on the concrete floor with the notebook in his lap, listening to his own breathing echo off the walls, and he was not afraid. For the first time in 4 years, he was sitting in a place that belonged to him. A place with walls and a roof and a door that locked. The darkness felt like privacy, like shelter. He slept in the bunker that night, on the cot, under the wool blanket that smelled like lanolin and old dust. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no other foster kids arguing at 2 in the morning, no television bleeding through thin walls. Just his heartbeat and the deep, patient silence of the earth. He woke to a pale rectangle of light where the bunker door stood open, and the cold morning air pooling down the ramp like water. He charged his phone in the Civic and came back to the notebook. Over the next 3 days, Marcus read every page. Joseph Delane had written in that notebook intermittently from 1962 to 1991. Almost 30 years of entries, some just a sentence, others filling pages. What emerged was a story of a man Marcus had never known but recognized immediately, because Joseph's loneliness read exactly like his own. Joseph had been a Korean War veteran. He came home in 1953 with shrapnel in his left leg and nightmares that never fully stopped. He married Helen in 1955. They had one son, Edward, born in 1957. Joseph worked as a welder in the Naval Weapons Center in Ridgecrest, which explained the military surplus supplies and the precise engineer's approach to the bunker. He built the shelter over 2 years, mostly on weekends, mostly alone. The entries from the 1960s were practical. Supply inventories, maintenance notes, plans for expansion he never completed. But starting in the early 70s, the tone changed. Helen left him in 1971. The entry for that day was 4 words long. Helen took Ed. Gone. Edward was 14 at the time. Marcus stopped reading. He sat on the cot with the notebook open in his hands and the desert silence pressed against the concrete walls, and he thought about himself at 13, standing on that gravel driveway. His father had been the same age when his world broke apart. The symmetry was so precise it felt designed, like pain was genetic, passed down through blood like eye color or the shape of a jaw. Joseph spent the next 20 years alone. The entries grew longer, more reflective, sometimes rambling. He tried to find Edward. He wrote letters that came back unopened. He hired a private investigator in 1983 who located Edward in Sacramento, working as a long-haul trucker, but Edward refused contact. The investigator's report was folded into the notebook, a single typed page that said, "Subject declined communication and requested no further attempts." Joseph kept writing anyway, as if the notebook had become the son who wouldn't listen. And then Marcus found the wall. It was on his 4th day at the bunker. He had been inventorying the supplies, trying to figure out what was still usable, when he moved a stack of jerry cans from the far left corner and found that the wall behind them was different. The rest of the bunker had bare concrete walls, gray and utilitarian, but this section, roughly 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, had been plastered smooth and then carved into. Not scratched, carved. With precision and patience, using what must have been a chisel and hours upon hours of work. It was a family tree. Joseph had carved a family tree into the wall of his bunker. At the top was a name Marcus didn't recognize. Samuel Delane, born 1808, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Below Samuel were 2 branches, one leading to Joseph Delane, born 1931, Bakersfield, California, and another to a name that had been partially chiseled away and was unreadable. Below Joseph was Edward Delane, born 1957, Ridgecrest, California, and below Edward, added in what looked like fresher carving, less weathered, with slightly different chisel marks, was Marcus Edward Delane, born 1996, Barstow, California. Marcus stared at his own name carved into concrete by a man he had never met. His grandfather knew about him. Joseph had known Marcus existed. The carving looked recent, the edges sharper and cleaner than the names above. Joseph must have done it in his final years, sometime between Marcus's birth and Joseph's death. He had taken a chisel and a hammer and carved his grandson's name into the wall of a bunker in the desert, the only permanent thing he had left. But that was not what shattered Marcus. Below his own name, in the same careful lettering, Joseph had carved a sentence. It stretched across the bottom of the family tree like an inscription on a headstone. The letters were 3 inches tall, and every single one had been carved with the stoniness and deliberation of a man who wanted these words to outlast him. I kept this place for you. I'm sorry. I couldn't keep anything else. Marcus sat on the concrete floor of that bunker with his back against the opposite wall, staring at those words, and he cried in a way he had not cried since his mother's funeral. Not quietly, not with dignity. He cried the way a child cries when he has been holding it in so long that the sound that comes out is almost inhuman. A raw, broken noise that echoed off the concrete walls and came back to him like the bunker was crying too. His grandfather had tried. That was the part that broke him. Joseph Delane had not been an absent grandfather by choice. He had been a broken man in a broken family, separated from his son by circumstances and pride, and whatever unnamed damage the Korean War had done to his ability to hold things together. And when he couldn't reach his son, and when he learned somehow that he had a grandson, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He prepared. He stocked shelves. He maintained tools. He carved a name into a wall and waited for a boy who might never come. Marcus grieved for 3 days. He barely ate. He walked the 47 acres in circles, following coyote trails through the scrub, watching red-tailed hawks hunt kangaroo rats in the early morning. The desert didn't care about his grief. It was indifferent and immense, and somehow that was comforting. His pain was real, but it was small against the scale of the Mojave, and there was something freeing in knowing that. On the 4th day, a man showed up. Marcus heard the truck before he saw it. An old Ford F-150 with a camper shell, rust-colored to match the landscape, bouncing down the dirt track at walking speed. The driver was a wiry man in his 60s with skin the color and texture of saddle leather, wearing a stained baseball cap that said Ridgecrest Rotary, and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His name was Gene Harwell. He had been Joseph Delane's only friend. Gene parked a truck and stood 10 feet from Marcus with his hands in his pockets, squinting against the light, sizing up this teenager standing in the desert next to a '93 Honda Civic. He said, "You look like Ed." And then he said, "Joe told me you'd come eventually. Took you long enough." Gene told Marcus things the notebook couldn't. He told him that Joseph had been a quiet man, not unfriendly, but sealed up tight, like the bunker itself. He said Joseph had learned about Marcus through a Social Security death record when Edward died in 2002 in a single-vehicle accident on Interstate 5 near Redding. Edward was 45. He had been driving for 36 hours straight. Marcus didn't know his father had died 7 years before his mother did. His mother had never told him. Another silence. Another sealed room in the architecture of his family. Gene said that after Joseph learned about Edward's death, he spent weeks in the county records office tracking the paper trail. He found a birth certificate. Marcus Edward Delane, born February 12, 1996. Mother, Karen Pruitt. Father, Edward Delane. He tried to make contact, but Karen had moved, and Joseph was 80 years old, with no internet and a bad leg, and the world had gotten too fast and too wide for a man who had spent most of his life in a concrete room in the desert. So he carved. He put the name in the only place he could, and he updated his will, and he told Jean Harwell to keep an eye out. Jean also told Marcus something harder. The county wanted the land, not for its value, which was negligible, but because a developer from Las Vegas had been buying up desert parcels for a proposed solar farm, and parcel 7714 sat in the middle of the planned array. The developer had offered $12,000. The county tax office had sent Joseph 2 delinquency notices and was prepared to seize the property within 18 months if taxes weren't settled. Marcus owed $640 in back taxes. He had $411 to his name. The developer's representative showed up 2 weeks later. A woman in a white SUV with tinted windows and a Bluetooth earpiece, wearing clothes that had never touched desert dirt. She stood at the edge of the bunker ramp and looked at Marcus like he was part of the landscape, something to be cleared away. She offered $15,000. She said it was generous. She said the property would be seized anyway. She said he should take the money and do something smart with his life. Marcus said no. She came back 3 days later with a different number, $18,000. Marcus said no again. She asked him what he planned to do with 47 acres of dirt and a hole in the ground. He didn't have an answer, but the question made something harden inside him, something that had been soft and unsure. He said, "It's mine. My grandfather kept it for me." The woman left and didn't come back. But the tax bill didn't go away, and Marcus was running out of money. Jean Harwell saved him, not with money but with work. Jean knew every rancher, mechanic, and handyman in the Ridgecrest area, and he started bringing Marcus along on jobs. Fence repair, swamp cooler installation, hauling scrap. Marcus learned to weld in Jean's garage using equipment that was older than he was, and it turned out that welding ran in the Delane blood. His hands were steady and his beads were clean, and Jean said once, without looking at Marcus directly, "Joe would have liked watching you do that." Marcus paid the back taxes on March 15, 2014. $640. The clerk at the county office stamped the receipt and handed it back without comment. Marcus held that piece of paper like it was a deed to a kingdom. Weeks passed. Marcus cleared the bunker methodically. He organized the tools on the pegboard, matching each one to its painted outline, restoring the order his grandfather had created. He tested the jerry cans and found that 12 still held water, which he poured out and replaced with fresh water hauled from town. He discovered the ventilation system, 2 6-inch pipes running at angles through the earth to the surface, fitted with hand-cranked fans that still turned with a little oil and persuasion. By the 3rd month, he had turned the bunker into a livable space. He ran a solar panel, 1 panel, 60 watts, bought used from a surplus store for $35 to charge a battery that powered a light and his phone. He built a shelf for the notebook, which he kept in a plastic bag to protect it. He cooked on a camp stove at the top of the ramp in the evenings, and the smell of beans and rice drifted out over the desert and mixed with the sage. People in Ridgecrest started to hear about him. The boy in the bunker, the Delane kid, a woman named Maria Espinoza, who ran the thrift store on China Lake Boulevard, started setting aside blankets and kitchen supplies for him. The owner of the hardware store let him have damaged goods at half price. A retired teacher named Dorothy Phelps brought him books, real books, and left them in a cardboard box at the top of the ramp without saying much, because Dorothy understood that some people need help delivered without ceremony. Marcus read everything: history, science, novels, manuals. He read about desert architecture. He read about earth-sheltered buildings. He started sketching plans in a new notebook, a composition book from the dollar store that was identical to his grandfather's, for expanding the bunker. Not to make it bigger, but to bring white into it. He designed a solar chimney. He planned a greenhouse built into the hillside above the bunker, using the thermal mass of the earth to regulate temperature. He showed the plans to Jean, who looked at them for a long time and then said, "Well, let's start with the foundation." They worked through the spring and into the summer of 2014. The desert summer nearly killed the project. Marcus learned that you could only work before 10 in the morning and after 5 in the evening, and the hours between were for staying underground, in the cool of the bunker, reading and planning. He lost 15 pounds. He couldn't afford to lose. He drank water constantly and still got headaches. But the greenhouse took shape. It was crude, built from reclaimed windows and concrete block and rebar, but it worked. By September, Marcus was growing tomatoes and peppers in the Mojave Desert. In soil he had amended with composted scrub brush and rabbit manure he collected from the desert floor. The eureka moment didn't come from the property. It came from the notebook. Marcus had read it cover to cover multiple times, but on one late night in October, reading by the glow of his single solar-powered bulb, he found something he had missed. In the back of the notebook, past the last dated entry from 1991, Joseph had glued in a photograph. It was small, 2 by 3 inches, black and white, and it showed a young black man in military uniform standing in front of a house. On the back, in Joseph's handwriting, it said, Samuel Delane, Greenwood District, Tulsa, 1920. Samuel, the name at the top of the family tree carved into the wall. Born 1898, Marcus looked up the Greenwood District. And then he understood why his family had no roots, no grandparents, no stories passed down, no Christmas traditions, no heirlooms, no old photographs in frames. The Greenwood District of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was Black Wall Street. In 1921, it was burned to the ground in one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history. Over 300 people killed, 10,000 left homeless, an entire community, an entire world erased in 2 days. Samuel Delane had survived. He had taken whatever he could carry and gone west to California, and he had started over with nothing. And his son Joseph had grown up with a father who never talked about where he came from. And Joseph had grown up to be a man who built a bunker in the desert and sealed it against a world that he had learned from birth could be taken from you in a single night. The bunker wasn't paranoia, it was memory. It was 100 years of a family learning that the ground under your feet could be set on fire, and the only thing you could do was dig deeper. Marcus sat with that photograph in his hands for a very long time. The bunker hummed with its deep quiet. He could hear his own heartbeat and the faint whisper of air through the ventilation pipes, a sound like breathing, like the desert itself was alive and sighing in its sleep. He added Samuel's photograph to the wall. He found a jar of epoxy in his grandfather's tool supplies and sealed the photo to the concrete, right above the family tree where it would last. And below the inscription his grandfather had carved, Marcus took a chisel from the pegboard, the same chisel Joseph must have used, and he carved his own line into the wall. The letters were rough. He was no stonemason, but they were legible, and they were true. I'm staying. I'm staying. The following spring, a reporter from the local paper, the Daily Independent, came out to do a story about the teenager living in the desert bunker. The article ran with a photograph of Marcus standing at the top of the ramp, the greenhouse visible behind him, his hands dirty, his face thinner than a 17-year-old's face should be, but his eyes steady. The headline called him the boy who inherited 47 acres of nothing and made it home. The story went regional, then national, the way stories sometimes do when they hit a nerve that people didn't know was exposed. An architecture professor from Cal Poly drove out to see the greenhouse and ended up offering Marcus a path to enrollment. A documentary filmmaker spent 3 days filming the bunker and the carving on the wall. A descendant of the Tulsa massacre contacted Marcus through social media and sent him a photograph of the Greenwood District before the burning. Rows of brick buildings and proud storefronts and people walking in their Sunday best. And in the background of one photograph, barely visible, a sign that read, Delane Welding and Repair. His great-grandfather had been a welder. Just like Joseph. Just like Marcus was becoming. The developer came back one more time with a number that had grown to $50,000. Marcus said no. He said it politely. He said, "My family has been moved enough." Marcus is 29 years old now. The property has grown from a bunker and a greenhouse into something that doesn't have an easy name. It is part homestead, part workshop, part museum. He completed his degree in sustainable architecture and came back to the desert, because the desert was where the Delanes had learned to endure, and endurance was the only inheritance that mattered. He teaches welding to teenagers from Ridgecrest and the surrounding towns. Kids who remind him of himself, kids with garbage bags for luggage, and that specific look in their eyes that means no one is coming to get them. The bunker is still there. Marcus keeps it maintained. The tools hang on the pegboard, oiled and ready. The cot still has the wool blanket folded at its foot. The notebook sits on its shelf in its plastic bag. And the wall, the carved wall, now has more names on it. Not Delanes by blood, but kids who came through the workshop and needed the place to belong. Marcus lets each one carve their initials below the family tree. And the wall is getting crowded, which is exactly how he wants it. On quiet evenings, when the workshop is closed and the students have gone home and the desert settles into its enormous silence, Marcus sometimes goes down into the bunker and sits on the floor across from that wall. He reads the names. He reads his grandfather's inscription. He reads his own. And sometimes, in the deep stillness of that concrete room, in the air that still carries the faintest trace of machine oil and old paper and time, he swears he can hear something. Not a voice exactly, more like a presence. The weight of a hand on his shoulder that isn't there. The feeling of being seen by someone who didn't live long enough to see him in person, but carved his name into a wall anyway, just in case. Just in case he came. The desert at night is not empty. It is full of sounds if you know how to listen. Coyotes calling across the flats. The rustle of a kid fox in the scrub. The slow creak of a Joshua tree bending in the wind. And underneath all of it, if you are very quiet, the sound of the earth itself, patient, ancient, holding everything that has ever been buried in it, keeping it safe until someone comes along who is ready to dig. Marcus was ready. He just had to be kicked out into the world first to find his way to the place that was always waiting for him, sealed and silent and full of a love that had no way to reach him except through concrete and time. Some people inherit money. Some people inherit houses. Marcus Delane inherited a hole in the ground and a dead man's apology, and it turned out to be worth more than any of it, because it taught him the one thing no one had ever taught him before, that someone had been thinking about him in the dark, that someone had carved his name into something permanent, that even in a family defined by silence and distance and loss, love had found a way to leave a mark. And if you ever drive out past Ridgecrest, past the last paved road, down a dirt track that still hasn't been maintained, you will find a low mound in the desert with a greenhouse glinting on top of it and a steel door standing open to the sky. And if you walk down the ramp and step inside, the first thing you will feel is the cool air rising up to meet you like a greeting. And the first thing you will see on the far wall, lit by a single solar-powered bulb, are the names. All of them. Carved into concrete. Going nowhere.